We felt it was really important for policymakers and the public generally to understand that, in particular for semiconductor manufacturing, this is a very capital intensive industry. There's huge costs involved. A new advanced logic foundry can be well over $20 billion at the 5 nanometer and below node. And what's really important when companies decide when and where to build a fab, first, of course, is market demand. And companies are always going to be building fabs based upon what they think is going to be an increase in demand for their semiconductor devices, whether it's mobile phones, whether it's AI, whether it's 5G communications. That's really the most important factor in terms of when companies decide to build fabs, is if they project an increase in demand. But where they build the fab, there's a lot of other factors that come into play. For example, whether or not there's good utilities, water, infrastructure, whether or not there's good intellectual property protection so that these valuable assets and trade secrets will be protected. In addition, whether or not there's a good pipeline of talent coming from universities, PhDs who can help develop the next generation of technology. But in addition to that, there are many governments around the world that provide incentives for semiconductor manufacturing companies to build fabs in their countries. And unfortunately, over the last couple of decades, the United States, at least at the federal level, has really not offered similar incentives. Increasingly, as semiconductors are becoming a more important topic by governments, we get a lot of questions. Why are more fabs built outside of the United States than inside? And we felt it was really important to try and answer that question with the Boston Consulting Group together in this joint report. And we found, as a conclusion, that one of the major differences between building a fab in the United States and in other countries is that the United States does not offer those incentives for semiconductor manufacturing. In fact, because of that lack of federal government incentives, building and operating an advanced fab in the United States might be 28% more expensive than it would be in other parts of Asia. Even some parts of Europe, for example, are more cost competitive because governments offer some of these incentives. And so again, we felt it was really important to highlight this trend so that policymakers understand for this strategic industry, if they want to embrace a pro-competition strategy, there should be a good incentive policy to encourage that kind of investment, whether it's in manufacturing or research development inside their country. According to the study that we conducted with the Boston Consulting Group, we found that growth in semiconductor manufacturing capacity is projected to grow by 56% through 2030. And if the U.S. does not take action to ensure that it has a more competitive environment to offset some of its cost disadvantages, that the U.S. will only see 6% of that growth happen inside the United States. So that would be what would happen if the U.S. didn't take action, is simply less fabs will be built in the United States and those fabs will be built elsewhere. And our hope is that the U.S. can think really hard about how can the U.S. be more competitive. And again, we think the answer is to use smart tax and grant policy to help semiconductor companies. Doesn't matter if they're American, if they're Japanese, if they're Korean, any semiconductor company that wants to come to the United States to invest in a new fabrication facility, we think should be able to qualify for those type of incentives. So we also think that the United States needs to have a global outlook, and it needs to support and embrace global partners to build and be part of the U.S. semiconductor ecosystem. We think that that would be a tremendous success. As you mentioned, TSMC has announced intention to build a fab in the United States in Arizona. There's reports that Samsung too is interested in building an advanced node logic foundry potentially in the United States. That would be a huge win for the United States. We think that the U.S. should welcome investment from U.S. and foreign semiconductor companies because, as I mentioned, there's no one company or country that can do everything on its own. And I think the U.S. government should recognize this, and rather than focus on investing in areas where other countries may have a really strong expertise in. We should work with those companies in foreign countries and regions and partner with them to build a stronger global supply chain that's inside the United States, and in conjunction with other nations as well. If you think about it, an advanced new fab that we built in the United States or anywhere in the world also requires a global supply chain. Some of the advanced materials come from Germany or Japan for the photoresist. Some of the advanced manufacturing tools to build chips come from the Netherlands or Japan, the United States. And the engineers themselves are global, coming from all different countries with amazing backgrounds to help design and develop the manufacturing process. And then the manufacturing itself happens in multiple different countries, from front-end manufacturing to assembly, test, finally to consumption by the end user. Again, that's a really global activity. And even if a company like TSMC were to build a fab in the United States, it's still going to require a global supply chain for it to operate. And that's not a bad thing. That's the amazing aspect of our industry, is this deep global supply chain that makes us more efficient.